Good evening and welcome to Aware on the Air for the 7th week of 2015. Our program is presented by members and friends of Aware, a local peace group. Aware is an acronym for Anti-War, Anti-Racism Effort. I'm Carl Estabrook. Aware was established 13 years ago after the attacks of 9/11-2001 by citizens of Champaign-Urbana who realized that the U.S. government would use those crimes to justify its already long-standing attempts to exercise military control over the Middle East. Mideast gas and oil are needed by America's economic competitors in Europe and Asia, and control of them gives the U.S. an advantage over China, Germany, and other countries. Today, the U.S. government is conducting wars throughout the Middle East and promoting an ongoing proxy war against Russia and Ukraine that has already killed more people than America's client Israel killed in Gaza. The U.S. is making war in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Pakistan, Somalia, and Yemen. Our government remains what Reverend Martin Luther King called it long ago, the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. The Obama administration is even willing to risk nuclear war with Russia in order for the U.S. to control the Eurasian economy. Because war is good for business. We as Americans should be concerned with how the government, which supposedly represents us, uses terrorism as an excuse to enhance the profits of the very rich, the 1%. And it's working. 95% of income gains during the Obama years have gone to the 1%, while wages have continued to be flat or declining for most Americans. Median family income has continued to decline in the Obama years. Only a few American politicians on the right and left fringes of the Republican and Democratic parties are actually opposed to the Obama administration's killing of people abroad or even at home through our militarized police forces, who kill far more people than in other developed countries. President Obama is the 4th president in a row to bomb Iraq. He has now attacked more countries, 8, than the Bush-Cheney administration did. They could only manage to bomb 6 countries. If it's necessary to stop the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, ISIS, international law says that should be done under the direction of the United Nations. The Obama administration should not be allowed to use it as an excuse to control the energy resources of the region. Obama's drone program has been called the most extreme terrorist campaign of modern times. It targets people suspected of perhaps intending to harm us one day, and any unfortunates who happen to be nearby. On Terror Tuesdays, as White House aides call them, Obama chooses people to be killed with drones from baseball cards presented to him by the CIA. He has killed literally thousands of people that way, including hundreds of children. Meanwhile, U.S. death squads, special operations forces, are active already this year in 105 countries around the world. Their activities include killing, kidnapping, we call it rendition, and torture. In Mark Halperin's and John Heinemann's recent book, Double Down, President Obama is quoted as follows: "Turns out I'm really good at killing people," Obama said quietly. "Didn't know that was going to be a strong suit of mine." Close quote. The quote has not been denied. Champaign-Urbana Aware recommends that you contact the President and our representatives in Congress and tell them to stop killing people around the world and to bring all U.S. troops home. The Aware webpage and Facebook page have email addresses and phone numbers for President Obama, Senator Dick Durbin, Senator Mark Kirk, and Representative Rodney Davis. The Obama administration are committing murders around the world, but pretending that they aren't, in order to mislead the only enemy they really fear, the American people, who drove 2 presidents from office in the context of the Vietnam War. And the government is helped in this deception by a compliant, big business-run media, so Americans know far less about what's going on than citizens of other countries. We'll try to give a better account tonight with commentaries by Ron Zoke, Karen Aram, David Johnson, and I will be back with a comment on our pro-war senators. But we'll begin with Ron Zook. Where is the devil?
Yes, well, the devil, we're constantly told, is in the details, and there is not time here or perhaps the ability to go into all the details that we need to hear about concerning these matters of war and peace and racism and so on. So there are plenty of people who will tell you that the devil is in the Kremlin. This has become the new obsessive line of the American mainstream media and the administration. Russian aggression, Russian aggression, Russian aggression, and Russian aggression. Last week it was Putin corrupt, Putin corrupt, Putin corrupt, and Putin corrupt. So like Gilbert, I'm going to call myself a strategic thinker. I can't be bothered with those details. The devil is in the Kremlin, we're told, or maybe in the White House. Actually, the Supreme Court Justice Scalia has delivered himself of the opinion that the devil is an actual person, but he didn't tell us where that person is, so we still don't know where the devil is. Everybody's got to be somewhere, right? So please tell us, eminent Justice Scalia, where is the devil? But he hasn't done that yet. The USA and Israel are proceeding their operations, in the simple and devout faith, apparently, in money and firepower to redeem the world for American values of freedom, justice, and democracy and human rights and the rest, provided that we're not required to do what those things actually seem to suggest. So the big push now is the demonization campaign against Vladimir Putin, and refusal to talk about a lot of the details of what's going on. The privatization of American military action, for example, in the Middle East and in much of the world, it being turned over to contractors, profit-making organizations that the government has no responsibility to tell us about. Indeed, the whole thing is kept secret, and there's an enormous flurry of concern when someone like the truth tellers, like Snowden and the rest, tell us what's going on. Throughout, there's the assumption that war-making or military action can be controlled, contained, limited, and turned on and off at will. This is obviously false, but there's still the belief that we can do that, and there will not be escalation when we open the campaign against Russia, or the proxy campaign against Russia, that it will not escalate to a nuclear confrontation. I hope that's right, but I see no reason to really think so. So the press now is being suffused with opinion pieces. John Kampfner in the Telegraph in England, other people here telling us that we have to fight Russia and contain its aggression in Ukraine. Are there other people, other voices? John Mearsheimer, professor of international relations at the University of Chicago, who published a piece in the New York Times, "Don't Arm Ukraine." Stephen Cohen, and even, I understand, Kissinger and some other eminent figures who are saying, cool it, we don't need this, to open another front there in Ukraine. And yet we seem to be building toward some sort of armed confrontation with Russia. And I think that is sort of supreme folly. But anyway, I guess I'll stop there.
Thank you, Ron. I think. I mean, supreme folly, yes, and folly means foolishness, but unfortunately, these people think they have reasons for doing what they're doing. Yeah. You're watching Aware on the Air. We're talking about the war policy of the United States and its sources. And we'll go to David Johnson.
Okay. You know, I want to talk a little about today what's called revisionist history. And, you know, I don't want to have my segment to be a history lesson, but what I've been noticing lately, it's real interesting, is that there's a whole bunch of distorted propagandish revisionist history about Vietnam. And I mean, I've seen it on Netflix and I've seen it some other places, and these so-called documentaries that are totally take out of historical context the real story of what happened. What's interesting is that coming here in a couple months in April will be the 40th anniversary of the final pullout of U.S. Military from Vietnam in April of 1975. And, you know, I wondered why this is going on, and I think it has a lot to do with what's currently going on. In other words, the ruling class in this country and their insatiable greed for more and more need to have these various wars around different parts of the world. Not only the fact that war in of itself profits certain special corporate interests, but the fact that it's for control of you know, natural resources and cheap labor. And this recent, you know, thing with the Ukraine is, I mean, particularly absurd. I mean, it's beyond absurd. It's to the point of being lunatic. I mean, you're basically messing with another country that has it's probably as many nuclear weapons as the United States. And for what purpose? I mean, you know, let's go back to some real recent history about the Ukraine. Let's remember, folks, a couple years ago, the Ukraine had a democratically elected government. And then what happened? It was overthrown in a coup that was sponsored with our tax dollars. I mean, the Assistant Secretary of State, Victoria Nuland herself, was there on the streets bragging about it in Kiev. Back when it was going on. And since then, look what the government that they've gotten. It's basically, and this is no exaggeration, a fascist government. The current president of Ukraine basically thinks that the Nazis were the good guys in World War II and that the Russians were the aggressors. Basically appointing governors for various provinces without the vote by the people. And this is why these two provinces in the eastern part of the Ukraine don't want any part of this government, and they're fighting for their independence. You know, this has been somehow turned around to say that this is Russian aggression. I mean, this is just, I mean, a total denial of the facts, and it's fantasy. I mean, it's propaganda. And for what purpose? You know, what's going on, you know, not to mention there's enough problems going on in the Middle East. You think about all these things that's been going on with ISIS. You know, let's think about this, folks. Where did ISIS come from? Well, if it hadn't been for the invasion of Iraq in 2003, there would be no ISIS. Not to mention that ISIS was helped form by Saudi Arabia with its money, an intelligence agency. And remember, John McCain himself was in Syria just, what was it, a year or so ago after he left Kiev, talking about how great the new fascist government was and how they were freedom fighters. Went to Syria and actually had his pictures taken with a couple of our current leaders of ISIS saying that they were freedom fighters. You know, this is just, I mean, this is just craziness, and we got to put a stop to it. We have to demand that our elected representatives start representing us, the American people, as opposed to this 1% of the country that has no other interest for the American people, for the environment, or for the basically future of the world. This has to stop.
Thank you, David. Appreciate it. Karen Aram?
I'm just going to make one comment in relation to Vietnam, is that they started with small numbers of American advisors and trainers, which eventually grew to 550,000. So just as now we have U.S. Special Forces in over 100 countries. We call it mission creep, and that's exactly what we have now. In Ukraine currently, okay, we have announced that by spring we will deploy unspecified numbers of military to help rebuild, to help build Kiev's ramshackle National Guard. And being sent in significant numbers are U.S. special heavy mine-resistant armored vehicles that have been widely used in Afghanistan and Iraq. And the U.S. and Poland are currently covertly supplying the Ukraine with some weapons. Now, we know that at this point in time, Angela Merkel has said that the EU, Europe, they do not wish to send lethal weapons to the Ukraine. Maybe it's because they're on the same landmass and they know how dangerous it is. It's only here in D.C., in the U.S., where we're a little further away. We've got an ocean or so between us that we want to send lethal weapons to the Ukrainian government, which is tantamount to a declaration of war. Now, some neocons, I mean, bottom line, we know, as you've been saying, Carl, that the neocons, they want to pick a fight with Russia and put it in its place for daring to oppose U.S. policies, et cetera, et cetera. But some neocon fantasies, from what I've been reading here, this is an article by Eric Margolis, is that they call for the breaking up of the Russian Federation into small, impotent parts. And that is what many Russians actually believe, that this is indeed Washington's grand strategy, mixing military pressure on one hand and then social media subversion on the other, aided by Ukrainian oligarchs and rightists. Carl, I want to bring up the fact that on Democracy Now! This morning, Amy Goodman had a retired general, Air Force general, his last name was Wald, who actually now, he's retired, but he works for Deloitte, their management consulting division. And as I said, my experience working for Pricewaterhouse was that the management consulting division usually represents clients, and at that time they were mostly IT in the 90s. Clearly, Amy Goodman brought out the fact that he represents manufacturers of weapons, manufacturers or distributors of weapons. But he was there with Professor Mearsheimer, and they were having a dialogue. One question one suggestion that Wald made was that we don't need to worry about NATO encroachment on Russia because Poroshenko had made the statement in the mixed agreement that that wouldn't happen. And then there was a break, and it was never addressed further. And Carl, I'm wondering if you could address that for me.
Well, what they're talking about there is the fact that the point that Professor Mearsheimer was making on Democracy Now!, that the source of this problem is longstanding American policy that runs back indeed to the time of the breakup of the Soviet Union, back to the Clinton administration particularly, but also the earlier and later Bush administrations. And the point of this was that the U.S. At the time of the reunification of Germany, promised the then still extant Soviet government of President Gorbachev that the U.S. would not seek to move NATO, which is an anti-Russian federation of European militaries, any closer to the border of the Soviet Union. That would be the deal, that Russia would not object to the reunification of the Germanys, and America would not push its foreign military alliance any closer to Russia's borders. Perfectly reasonable sort of standoff. They can get along and work this way. And they even set up a joint NATO and Russian consultation to make sure that this was carried out. Well, in fact, what happened was that once the Soviet Union fell, the U.S. felt we're not bound by this anymore, therefore let's move NATO east and establish our military bases closer to the border of the Soviet Union, which they did in 1999 and 2004, and then again in 2008 tried to move it even further east into Georgia, which prompted a war, a brief war because of the crazy Georgian president who decided that he had America's backing to continue to provoke Russia. Now, what's happened here, what's happened in Ukraine, is that President Poroshenko, the oligarch who arranged to take on the presidency of the coup-established government, has said, okay, we won't try to get involved in NATO for at least a year. And I mean, what Russia has been outraged at, that is the violation of the agreement not to move the American military alliance to its borders. What Russia has been outraged about since the fall of the Soviet Union is being reenacted now by this coup that the U.S. produced in Ukraine. We produced a friendly government in Ukraine. It was all set to incorporate it into the EU, to the European Union and NATO organizations that are part of America's way of trying to control the Eurasian economy. That's what the overall fight is about, and the situation is lost on Americans who hear only from their media what Ron was summarizing earlier, Russian aggression. Russia, that's nonsense.
It reminds me of the credit card offers I often get that tell me they won't charge a fee for the first year.
That's an interesting parallel.
So, yeah. Is it any wonder Russia's holding off on that offer from the Ukraine, from Kiev?
Yeah, I have some white powder I'd like you to try.
Yes. Rule number
First
one.
in is free, right?
Yeah,
Right.
Yeah. Rule number one of geopolitics is that nuclear-armed powers must never, ever fight. And we're breaking that by our actions and our provocations right now.
Yeah, well, we're sliding toward it. We're bringing it on in violation of, what one general said about Iraq. It's whoever promotes a land war, a ground war on the Eurasian landmass should have his head examined. I mean,
Yeah.
that's just utter craziness, but we're doing it again.
Yeah.
Yeah, this original of that particular statement was, I think, Douglas MacArthur at the end of the Second World War, and then, of course, he got involved in a land war in Asia himself in regard to Korea. The answer to that, I remember in the early days of the Vietnamese War, was the American military who said that, well, Vietnam wasn't much of a war, it was just a little war. This was in the Kennedy's years when the attacks on South Vietnam began by the Kennedy administration. American generals said, well, it isn't much of a war, but it's the only war we've got.
Well, we can't say that anymore, can we?
Right. You're watching Aware on the Air. We've had a round of comments from the people on the panel, and we're going to go back around with comments on the comments. I have one, simply because it's locally related, that I'd like to mention at top. There is a decision on war. Decisions on war are being made in Washington, or at least announced in Washington today. The president is going to Congress to ask for a new authorization for the use of military force, as it's called. That's the modern American version of a declaration of war, AUMF. There were two AUMFs after 9/11, one to go after the terrorists, and the second one, of course, in the Bush administration, to go after Iraq. After all, we had to stop those weapons of mass destructions, didn't we? Right. Mass destruction. So the AUMF that passed in those days is the one that President Obama is relying on to kill people throughout the Middle East right now. And he's decided that in the current events, with the rise of ISIS, the Islamic Caliphate in Iraq and Syria, it's necessary to have a new declaration of war. Now, exactly what the administration is doing here is open to some discussion, wanting to make sure that they're not left in a vulnerable position as far as domestic politics are concerned, by insisting that both parties are supporting America's military action in the Middle East, which of course they are, but trying to forestall the possibility of the Republicans saying, well, Obama didn't do this war right. Which, of course, the Democrats have been busily saying about George Bush ever since 2003. But the request for a new authorization for use of military force is bound up with a decision to provide what they call defensive weapons to the coup government, the insurgent government, the fascist government, as Ron described it, in Kiev. Now, as John Mearsheimer pointed out on Democracy Now! This morning, the notion of a defensive weapon is, of course, silly. Any weapon, there are very few weapons that can be used only for defense and not for offense as well. Maybe a wall, I'm not sure. But it's not walls that they're talking about providing for Ukraine, it's weapons. While this debate is going on, because of course the European countries, particularly Germany and France, are very much against the idea of the U.S. promoting its war in Ukraine, as of course it is. They realize perfectly well what the American government is doing. The request for weapons to weaponize the Kiev fascists is getting some interesting support in Washington. Senator Robert Portman, a Republican of Ohio, and Senator Dick Durbin, our own senior senator, Democrat of Illinois, announced Monday that they were launching the Senate-Ukraine caucus to boost ties between Washington and Kiev. Now, that's from the news report. What does boost ties mean? The key focus of the brand new Senate-Ukraine caucus, with our senior senator in charge, quote, will be to play a prominent role in advocating for and coordinating more robust American efforts to support Ukraine, close quote. Robust. Now, that's a word that we're finding, I mean, that's been a war word for America for the last 20 years particularly, but robust means give them weapons, keep the fighting going in Ukraine. Part of the problem is the Ukrainian army, the Ukrainian military forces, the forces directed by the Koosters in Kiev, isn't doing very well as a military. They're getting beaten badly by the insurgent groups from the eastern part of the country, from the Donbass area, that are refusing to be ruled by the coup leaders in Kiev. Durbin, our senator, the senator that we're responsible for, says, and I quote, you might be quoting Ron, in the face of continued Russian aggression in the region and repeated assaults on the sovereignty of its borders, Ukraine needs a steadfast ally in the United States, close quote. Now, on the note that all politics are local, Durbin gives an excuse for his promoting killing, for his promoting murder and assault in Ukraine. I quote, "This bipartisan group sends a clear message that Ukraine has the unflinching support of the Ukrainian community in Illinois and in the United States Senate." So that might let you know what our representatives are up to.
Well, the very fact that the Ukrainians are here in Illinois means that they don't particularly want to live in the Ukraine or in Russia. I think that's obvious.
Ukrainians are here, not in Ukraine,
Right.
because of what the situation is there.
But does anyone think that the Russians, who lost close to 40 million soldiers and civilians in World War II, won't fight to defend their motherland? I mean, what insanity are we looking at now?
Well, particularly since as the German and French government, the Chancellor of Germany and the French President are making clear, you know, there are obviously diplomatic solutions. The diplomatic solutions have been sketched out in an agreement at Minsk less than a year ago. The constitutional arrangements that will be necessary to solve these difficulties are all there, but it's in fact the Ukrainian government, sponsored by the United States, the one that CNN calls U.S. troops, which is interesting, that's preventing that from happening. 2 weeks ago, they launched another attack on the separatist forces, as they are called, in the east, and the attack's gone very badly. And that's the reason that Ukrainians are calling on Washington for defensive weapons. They are getting beaten badly by the separatists.
Isn't this the same, Ukrainian government that calls these people in the eastern provinces, the Donetsk region, terrorists?
Yep.
I mean, they've killed over, the Ukrainian government's killed over 5,000 people in these eastern provinces.
right.
And they're supposedly terrorists, these people who are defending their homes and don't want to be any part of this fascist government. And we don't use that word lightly. This is the reality. These people who currently are in control of the Kiev Ukrainian government are fascist. I mean, there is no ambiguity about it. Let me ask Carl
One
and,
thing
oh,
on that
go
before
ahead.
you
Yes,
go
yes.
ahead, David. I just want to say there was a terrifying report this week from a UN operation. I just can't figure out what's going on here, that suggests that the casualties, the number of people killed by our government in Kiev, is far higher than reported. They say up to 50,000 people may have died in Donbass, in the eastern region of Ukraine, in the assaults from the Kiev government. That can't be possible.
I thought it was-
That can't be possible.
yeah.
But the fact that the possibility that it's much more than the 5,000
we
that's been
thought.
reported, that certainly is possible.
And what was the source on that information,
UN.
Carl? The United
UN
Nations?
A UN commission.
Commission,
Okay.
okay.
That's right.
yeah.
So exactly
Wow.
who was doing
Yeah.
it and where information is coming from, we don't know. But I mean, it was the idea that the casualty rate is much higher than we thought. That seems certainly possible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, what has not been reported here, and they may be referring to, is the fact that hundreds of people in the Kiev military have gone over to the other side.
Yes.
Ah, right.
Oh, really?
Right.
And
Oh,
they
well,
may be
this-
counting them.
This
really?
morning on CNN, they were making the announcement that the Kiev government and the military especially, many of their officers were Russian spies. Yes, they were Russian spies. And I'm sitting there and I'm thinking, wait a minute, that's ridiculous. Obviously, there are people who do not like seeing what their government is doing and they're rebelling in some way. So that's
Haven't
what
there
I
been
think,
protests in Kiev and other larger cities in
sure,
Ukraine against
sure.
this current government? But that never gets reported,
Sure.
it seems.
But they're
in the
being
corporate
labeled
media.
Russian spies
Yes.
now, yes.
They put
but
on trial a journalist in Kiev who had temerity to suggest in the public press in Kiev that people should resist the draft. The Kiev government has instituted a draft, including a draft of women, because it's having so much trouble getting people into its military to fight in the East. This guy said, well, you know, we should change the law. We should resist this draft. We shouldn't do this. They put him on a public trial in charges of treason. Yeah, so.
You know, the easiest solution to this problem is just let these people form their own province, you know, their own separate country.
Well, that's
I
what
mean,
the Minsk-
oh, is
That's
that
what the
what's so
Minsk
horrible?
agreement- that's-
You know?
That's
Yeah.
what the Minsk agreement called
Right.
for. It didn't even go quite that far. It said there need to be a new federal arrangement between Donetsk and Luhansk in the east, the Donbass region, and the central government. Just a new federal arrangement. Sort of like, you know, I mean, Florida and Georgia need to be reincorporated into the Union, you know.
Well, they need to be neutral. They can't join NATO.
Well, no, I thought the notion is that's what prompted Poroshenko's comment. The notion that the Minsk agreement included possibly Ukraine as a whole would be neutral. These, Donetsk and Luhansk would not be independent. They would be federal parts of Ukraine, and Ukraine as a whole would not be part of NATO, which has been the understanding from the beginning.
according to what I have here, in 2013, President Putin proposed a sensible negotiated settlement to the Ukraine dispute, and that autonomy for Eastern Ukraine and its right to speak Russian as well as Ukrainian.
Well,
That's
that's because people like Yulia Tymoshenko said, look, we've got to kill all the Russians. I mean, a major
Right.
political leader who was, put in jail for corruption in the previous regime but one, comes out of jail with the coup and says, kill all the Russians. We haven't heard much from Yulia recently, but, it was Hillary Clinton who was particularly involved in getting Yulia out of jail, apparently.
Oh, is that why China refused to negotiate with?
Tymoshenko?
Yeah, I think so.
Uh-huh.
At that time, in other words, they'd already started an agreement to make these loans to the Ukraine with yachts, but then they waited until Poroshenko to implement them because they wouldn't deal with her, I guess. Yeah.
Let
Something
me
like
ask
that.
Carl
Sorry, I
and some.
interrupted you,
That's
Dave.
okay, and some of the, Ron and Karen too. Just to put some of this in perspective, how many military bases does Russia have outside of Russia?
Oh,
We were talking about that last week.
Yeah, yeah.
And, I
Two,
was saying,
three?
Yeah.
I was saying that I looked around for a while, admittedly, not the most penetrating, perhaps, historical investigation, but I could find a dozen.
A dozen?
A dozen bases.
Yeah.
And what countries were those in?
Most of them in Russia.
Yeah, in Eastern
Some
Europe.
yeah,
There-
Sevastopol, I think you mentioned,
Well,
which is
that's even
part of the
questionable right
Ukraine.
now because that's Crimea.
Right,
You
it's
know,
Crimea,
whose
right,
is
right.
Crimea. But
Yeah.
about a dozen.
Yeah, Syria, I think, had maybe one naval base.
And we found one Chinese base. I
Okay.
think.
How many U.S. military bases does the United States government have around the world?
Nobody knows because there's too many and they can't count them.
Well, I've heard 800,
We're
900.
up to 1,000.
Yeah,
Okay.
almost 1,000.
William Bloom has suggested 1,000. There
Mm-hmm.
have been several other suggestions. But I mean, you know, they're all over the world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How many countries has Russia invaded in the last, I don't know, since, you know, the end of the Cold War, since 1990? I don't know of any. How many countries has the United States invaded or overthrew democratically elected governments since 1990? I know, okay, Afghanistan, Iraq. Let's see, what else? I mean, you can help me out here.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
Okay.
It'll take us a while, right?
Some people might, you know, of course, there's, again, revisionist history. They're trying to say that little border dispute between Russia and the country of Georgia, that Russia supposedly invaded Georgian territory, but it was just the opposite. The Georgians invaded the Russian territory, actually, and they got their butts kicked, you know. And then all of a sudden, we just, media just, you know, corporate media here in this country just kind of conveniently let that story die. Also, what about that Malaysian airliner that was shot down in the Ukraine? Funny how that story just kind of disappeared.
It disappeared too because a number of countries said, "Well, we'll investigate and we'll let you know."
Right.
For some reason, they haven't checked back.
Well, we
So
did have.
let's
the
take
Dutch
all
government
these.
just issued a report about that, most of which was redacted. It was blacked out.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, but of course they were trying to blame Russia at first for doing this and everything. So I guess let's put this in context. Who's the aggressor here? I mean, come on, people. I mean, let's look at reality here, not fantasy or propaganda. I'm sorry, but you know what? I'm tired of our tax dollars and these lying politicians saying they represent us, and then all they do is go out and cause problems, mess with other countries, cause more difficulties for Americans who are traveling abroad because of, gee whiz, I guess how would the average American feel if there was all sorts of subterfuge and actual outright aggression happening on our soil by, say, China, let's say. I mean, you don't think we'd have hard feelings towards Chinese? I mean, this is just craziness. I mean, this doesn't help anybody but these greedy, wealthy elitists who control our government and increasingly controlling our democracy. And I'm just getting sick of it. I'm sorry I'm getting emotional here today, but I'm hearing all these lies every day on the corporate media, and I'm sick of this. I mean, I truly am, and I don't think I'm alone out there in this feeling. You go ask the average American on the street that's not totally brainwashed by some ridiculous film like American Sniper that had no historical context whatsoever, and you talk to the average American out there, they just want to get on with their lives and improve the lives for themselves and their family the best way they can, and not bother with it, and don't mess with anybody else in the world. I mean, you know, of course, the people, I can hear the howls now, isolationist. Well, I don't think the United States should be isolationist, but I think they should be out there in the international community helping people improve their lives, not trying to invade countries, overthrow democratically elected governments, and kill people. I mean, is that too much to ask?
Thank you, David. There's an interesting article in the Washington Post this week in response to the attitudes that you're describing. It was done by political scientists, quite remarkable. I don't have a high opinion of political scientists as a breed, but they've been notably quiet during the last decade or so of American aggression in the Middle East. But there was a guest post in the Washington Post from 3 political scientists who examined Americans' attitude towards Ukraine and the war in Ukraine. They write, since Russian troops first entered the Crimean Peninsula in early March last year, a series of media polling outlets have asked Americans how they want the U.S. to respond to the ongoing situation. Although 2/3 of Americans have reported following the situation at least somewhat closely, that was the box they checked, most Americans actually know very little about events on the ground or even where the ground is. In
Right.
March of last year, these political scientists asked a national survey of more than 2,000 Americans what action they wanted the U.S. to take in Ukraine. But with a twist, they also asked the survey respondents to locate Ukraine on a map. We found that only 1 out of 6 Americans can find Ukraine on a map, and the farther their guesses were from Ukraine's actual location, the more they wanted the U.S. to intervene with military force. So, I mean, the American media, once again, are doing their job. They're supporting American war plans by making sure Americans are not informed about what's going on, but that they have the right attitude about what's going on. They know about, as Ron says, Russian aggression, Russian aggression, Russian aggression. And it's really it's astonishing, the result these people got. They produce a map of where people thought Ukraine was. Everywhere from the South Pacific to Western United States, to Canada, to Alaska, they put a chart of the places people chose and color code them as to how close or how far away they are from actually Ukraine and Eastern Europe. Well, the people who didn't know where it was said, well, I don't know where it is, but we got to attack those people because of Russian aggression.
Yeah.
Well, this just goes back to the Hitler's propaganda minister Goebbels, whose famous quote is, if a government repeats a lie over and over and over again to its population, the majority of the people will eventually believe it, at least for a while. And I think this is exactly what's happening with the corporate media. But I mean, you know, that's what's interesting. If you look at the track record of what our government's done in the world, I mean, going back, 10, 20, 30, 40 years, I mean, they don't have a very good track record. I mean, lie after lie after lie after disaster, after death, destruction of both American and non-American lives. I mean, this should be a clue. I mean, right then and there is that, habitual liars, do you trust habitual liars? I mean, probably everybody's met at least one in their life, so why should we Americans believe the corporate media in this country and the current U.S. government? Because they've got nothing but a track record of lies. And, it's just amazing. And of course, I think with polling, Carl, too, it depends on how you ask the question. Yeah. A lot of times you get a lot different results depending on how it's phrased.
Karen?
I just want to make one point related to the Crimea and the great Russian naval base that you discovered there in Sevastopol. Yeah.
Or as close as I come.
That's as close as I can come to. It became part of the Ukraine when Kiev declared independence in '91. But the vital base was always occupied and guarded by Russia's military. Ukrainians were a minority in the Crimea, whose original Tatar inhabitants were mostly ethnically cleansed by Stalin. So most of those Russian troops who supposedly invaded the Ukraine actually came from the giant Sevastopol base, which was under joint Russian and Ukrainian sovereignty.
Well, the other aspect of this that I might mention is that interests me is the demonization campaign that's going on with respect to Putin personally. And we always need to personalize these things and point out who's the good guy and the bad guy.
He's a new Hitler, as Hillary Clinton said.
Right. Well, this stuff started coming out in the past couple of weeks. Maybe he has Asperger's syndrome.
Yes. Right. He's probably nuts.
He's in the autistic spectrum somewhere.
Actually, I think it's many of these American commentators who have that.
And this demon, let's see. Well, it became explicit in this article, the British article that I referred to. It finally came out, the one that's always the culminating statement in these demonization campaigns. He's a madman.
Yeah. Exactly.
We got to the madman accusation relatively quickly this time.
Then why do you provoke a madman? I mean, think about it. If he really was, and didn't you say
he has to be eliminated.
Well, wasn't that one of Nixon's ploys that if they think I'm crazy, then they'll back away or back off?
They just don't know what I'll do.
Don't laugh, but in Thailand, when I would be driving by some of the traffic policemen who would try to stop me to get money, I was told that, they'll be afraid of you if they think you're insane. So once I actually did this, I was so irritated, I went like this, and they backed away. So maybe we should use some common sense if we really
Has
believe this
anybody
stuff.
heard anything that, as far as Joe Biden's son? Doesn't he own some?
He's-
What's the story on that as far as
he's-
Ukrainian
he's-
natural gas?
He works for the company, and he's on their board of directors.
How interesting.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
He was appointed to the
Surely a
board
coincidence, right?
about a year or so
surely.
ago.
And one thing we don't hear from, in the demonization of President Putin that Ron was talking about, what we don't hear from is what President Putin himself has to say. One of the advantages of the internet these days is we can read the Russian press, we can read sources from Russia that actually do report what the Russian government has said, notably the president and the foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov. Both have had interesting things to say. For example, Putin is in Egypt right now. He's in Cairo,
yeah.
where he's just left. He was there in part because of arms deals between the Egyptian government, which we sponsor too, of course, and Russia. He brought the president of Egypt a Kalashnikov, a particularly nice Kalashnikov, made in a Russian arms factory. It turns out that literally millions of Russians vacation in Egypt, and that there's a tourism industry that's very important to the Egyptian economy from Russia. Now, Russia's political involvement in Egypt these days involves also the fight against ISIS, against the caliphate in Iraq and Syria, which Egypt is ostensibly involved with, along with the Gulf states, the United Arab Republic, the United Arab Emirates, and others. Now, what Putin had to say about this fight when he got to Cairo yesterday is really quite interesting. I quote, "Regrettably, we must note that the actions being undertaken today by the members of the anti-terror coalition," it's a Russian phrase, but that's the anti-terror coalition, which means the U.S. and the Gulf states and others that are supposedly using air power against ISIS. That's the anti-terror coalition he refers to. He says, "We must note the actions being undertaken today by the members of the anti-terror coalition, including Egypt, their strategy and tactics are disproportionate to the scale and nature of the existing threat. Airstrikes alone are not enough to deal with it. What is more, such actions lack legitimacy since they were not directly sanctioned by the UN Security Council, and in certain cases are taken without the consent of states whose territories are being targeted." Now, what he means is the fact that in dealing with ISIS, international law is absolutely clear. Military action against this group should be coordinated by the United Nations Security Council that decides under the terms of the UN Charter, to which the U.S., of course, is a signatory, that a military threat exists and a military response is authorized. That's all Putin's asking for, the most traditional arrangement possible. Of course, the U.S., which wants to control the region militarily and has for generations, is going on and carrying its war against a complex group of opponents. As David pointed out earlier, many American government officials have had strange and interesting relationships with these opponents, the various groups that go together to make up ISIS, John McCain. But Putin points out that the thing is being done as an American campaign, not as, according to the terms of international law, an activity authorized by the UN Security Council. And what he refers to in that last clause is the fact that the U.S. is bombing Syria, says it's bombing ISIS, but it's bombing within the borders of Syria, and without, obviously, the consent of the government of Syria, because the U.S. is in the business of trying to overthrow the government of Syria.
Right.
So the complications are very great, and this madman Putin seems to be calling on the U.S. to observe international law. Isn't that
Right.
crazy?
Yes.
Well, one of the remarkable things about all this all along has been, to me, the relative sensibility and restraint of Putin and Lavrov in their statements.
Yes.
I think you're absolutely right.
And as far as ISIS is concerned, who's really been doing the heavy lifting on the ground? I mean, you look at the Kurds that are in the Kobani region, which basically are, there's two factions of Kurds. These Kurds are the ones that were actually considered terrorists by the United States government. Why? Not because they ever harmed an American or set off any bombs in the United States or any embassies or whatever, just because of the United States' relationship with the government of Turkey, which has repressed the Kurds in the area for, I mean, going back decades. These Kurds in Kobani are the only ones that have defeated ISIS on the ground. But you watch what happens. I mean, if ISIS somehow does become defeated eventually, I can guarantee you that our government will be wanting to bomb the Kobani Kurds next, because it'll be a threat to their control of the region. Because these Kurds in the Kobani area have their own autonomous government set up, and believe me, it's not a neoliberal structured government. So it definitely wouldn't be to Washington, D.C., the elites in Washington, D.C.'s liking. Just another little interesting factoid here, folks. It's what's another layer of the onion, or how should I say? Oh, what a tangled web we weave.
Right. David is getting poetic, so we should probably move on. No, you're quite right, and the points need to be made, and they are, of course, not being made in our media.
No, not at all.
We have a few minutes left on Aware on the Air. Do we have other things we want to turn to? We haven't mentioned Greece today.
Oh, yes.
Could we say a word or two about Greece?
One thing I know is that I read somewhere where the stock markets are falling on fears that Greece is going to withdraw from the EU currency,
Right.
EU. And so, well, if the ECB, if the Troika doesn't give a little and negotiate with Syriza, then yeah, that's what they may have to
I
do.
think it's important to note in the old SDS motto that everything is connected, that the actions towards Greece being taken by the EU, and notably Germany, are bound up with the actions towards Russia and what the U.S. wants Germany to do vis-a-vis Russia.
Right.
So the matter is complex, and I think, quite hopeful events in Greece, where the Greek populace, the Greek voters, established a government that says that the austerity program that's been run by the neoliberal European Union Troika, the three major institutions that run the European economy, that has got to stop. Austerity has got to come to an end. And as Karen suggests, this is ruffling feathers in the European financial dovecote, and they are capable of almost anything, I think. Stop the challenge that the Greek government proposes. They are capable even of making some concessions. So there may be some interesting developments there. The Greek government, the new Greek government, has already said that it would veto the European Union sending any military reinforcements to Ukraine. So, the decision would have to be taken unanimously by the 28 EU countries, including Greece. So the question of what to do with Greece on the part of the EU economic leaders is also bound up with the question of what to do in the American campaign against Russia.
Did they say that they were going to veto it? Because I know they asked the question, and last week I read from an article, or I read from someone, at the moment it escapes me who it was disappointed that they didn't go ahead with the veto, but in fact they went ahead with the EU
I
on
think
that.
you're talking about the veto of the sanctions of Europe. What happened just after the Syriza government was elected. The EU had to make a decision about extending sanctions put in place by the United States, but sanctioned by the EU against Russia for the next period of time. And there was some thought that the Greek government might vote against that. They didn't, and a lot of the supporters of the Greek government were surprised about it. The question of arms to Ukraine is a different issue.
Oh, okay.
And I think that's the one where they threaten and of course these things work in interesting ways. The German government is very much against the idea of sending arms to Ukraine, and they're perfectly happy to have the Greeks on board with them.
Right.
At the same time, they're doing their best to destroy the Greek government's economic plans.
Yeah.
So,
You know, it's really got the elites in Europe really frightened is that now it looks like Spain might go the same way of
Yep.
Greece with the
Absolutely.
Podemos party. And there's also rumblings in Portugal and Ireland.
and in Italy, even.
Italy.
Even in Italy.
Yes.
Quite right.
So, I mean, this is the interesting thing that's never reported in the U.S. corporate media is that with the election of Syriza in Greece, that the average European working person was just delighted and thrilled. I mean, because you got to understand that all these policies that Germany and France, Great Britain, and these other countries have done, from anywhere from their economic policies to their foreign policy, in other words, sending troops to Afghanistan, for instance, was opposed by even bigger, much huger margins in Europe than it was here in the United States. I mean, we're talking like opposition in the 78th percentile. So, but yet the governments went ahead and did it anyway. And this is the problem with neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is not democratic. It doesn't work in the best interest of the average working person. And at this point, they've gotten to so arrogant and powerful, it's like, well, screw you, what are you going to do about it to the average citizen out there? Well, it looks like something's finally being done about it, and I think this has got the elites frightened. So hopefully this spreads fast through the rest of Europe and eventually here across the ocean to us.
And it's also true, as it's true in the United States, that economic questions and military questions are bound up together. What the U.S. does in regard, what the Obama administration does in regard to the economy, and what the Obama administration does with the overwhelming part of its national budget that's spent on killing people abroad. These things, these questions are connected. And by insisting on the connection, between neoliberalism, which means to despoil the populace for the profits of the 1%, and neoconservatism, which means to despoil foreigners for the profits of the 1%, when that connection becomes more evident to a populace, there's more objection to it. I think we saw an inchoate version of that in these last midterm elections, where the most important statistics may be the fact that the lowest percentage of American voters turned out than since the middle of World War II. Now that's not an accident. Things are happening here under the surface that our leaders are very much worried about, both in Europe and America. And our best job is to try to understand what's happening there and try to convince our fellow citizens that we should have an effect on it. Concluding comments, ladies and gentlemen?
Yes, in regard to that, Carl, pick up the latest edition of the Public Eye newspaper. It's free. I've got an article in there about what happened in the 2014 midterm elections.
Good. You've been watching Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group. Our show is produced and directed by Jason Liggett. Thanks to whom also this program and others like it will be available on YouTube. And see the Facebook page for Aware for articles and addresses and other things referred to by the panel this evening. Finally, Aware honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about, but Americans don't. Manning, Assange, Snowden, and others who are being persecuted by the Obama administration. Now, this is Carl Estabrook for Ron Zoke, Karen Evans-Levy, Stuart Levy, Karen Aram, David Johnson, David Green, and other members and friends of Aware, saying in the words of the late Edward Murrow, good night and good luck.